The first time Elise saw the house, she had to double-check the address. It wasn't a house so much as a statement, a broad-shouldered modern structure of stone and steel, perched just beyond the tree line like it didn't quite belong. The summer wind rustled through the pines around it, but the building itself held still, unmoved, like the man who owned it. "Are you sure this is it?" she whispered to herself, cutting the engine of her aging Civic. The driveway was gravel, but even the gravel felt deliberate, bordered by hand-laid stone and softened by wildflowers growing up through the edges like someone had tried very hard to make natural look accidental. She grabbed her duffel from the back seat and glanced again at the email. Private residence, full-time summer nanny for 8-year-old girl, experience preferred, quiet, grounded presence required. That last line had made her pause, not bubbly, not high energy, grounded, quiet. It wasn't the kind of thing people usually said when hiring someone to care for a child, but something about it had caught her. A moment later, the front door opened, and out stepped a man she recognized instantly, even if she hadn't seen his face in person before. Colin Hart, CEO of Arcadia Systems, widower, interviewed once by Forbes as a strategic mastermind and once by Vanity Fair as an iceberg with cheekbones. He stood on the slate porch barefoot, wearing a navy Henley and jeans, his posture straight but not cold, his expression unreadable. "You're Elise," he said, not asked, just stated as though he'd already known. "Yes," she replied, resisting the urge to wipe her palms on her jeans. "Elise Mercer." He nodded, gave no hand to shake. "She's in the backyard, follow the path to the right." And with that, he turned and walked back inside. Elise stood there a moment longer than she meant to, feeling the full impact of what she'd just stepped into. Not just a job, not just a summer, something heavier in the air. The path led through a grove of birch trees, their white trunks glowing against the darker pine. The house curved along the trees like it was watching them, and then she heard it, laughter. She came through the trees and found a girl curled up on a hanging bench swing, bare feet tucked under her, a chapter book open in her lap. "Hi," Elise said gently. The girl looked up. Brown hair escaped her ponytail, wild around her ears. Her face was soft with freckles and flushed with the kind of joy that only comes from being left alone in peace. "Hi," the girl said. "Are you Elise?" "I am." "I'm Sophie." She squinted at Elise like she was studying a butterfly. "You don't look like a nanny." "What do I look like?" Sophie tilted her head. "You look like someone who talks to birds." Elise laughed softly, the sound surprising even herself. "I've been known to." They sat together on the swing for a while, and Sophie offered no more conversation, but didn't seem to mind Elise's presence either. When she finally turned a page in her book and leaned into Elise just slightly, Elise felt it like a small door opening inside her. That evening, Colin met her again in the kitchen, sleek, stainless steel, and somehow still warm under the soft lights above the island. He poured himself a cup of tea, but didn't offer her one. "She's had 3 nannies in the past year," he said without preamble. "None of them lasted more than a month." Elise nodded. "I read the file you sent. I'm not interested in resumes, just consistency. She doesn't need entertainment. She needs quiet, good food and someone who knows how to let silence be comfortable." Elise didn't know whether he was talking about Sophie or himself. "I understand," she said. He looked at her for a long beat, then nodded once and left the kitchen. Over the next few days, Elise learned the rhythms of the house. Breakfast was simple and mostly silent. Colin read the paper, Sophie read a book, and Elise made French toast without asking if they wanted any. They always ate it anyway. Afternoons were for swimming in the cold lake at the bottom of the hill, drawing in the little studio at the back of the property, or wandering the woods with Sophie's sketchpad in tow. Sophie was bright but careful, like she'd learned early on that adults sometimes disappeared without warning. She didn't ask many questions but often answered Elise, with more honesty than expected. "Do you miss school?" Elise asked one morning as Sophie collected pinecones in the woods. "No, the kids were loud. I don't like loud." "Do you miss your mom?" Sophie stopped, looked up. She was loud too. And that was all she said about it. Colin was a shadow in the mornings and a ghost in the evenings. He worked from the office upstairs with the big glass window overlooking the lake. Sometimes he watched them from up there. Elise felt it more than saw it, but he rarely joined. Only once did he appear without warning, barefoot again, to fix a broken screen door. "You built this place?" she asked as he screwed the hinge back into the wood. "I designed it. It's beautiful." "It's safe," he said instead and walked away. Each day slipped past without much conversation, but something settled in the space between them all. Elise had worked for families before, some kind, some careless, but this was different. This felt like being let in slowly, like the woods around them. Not a gate but a glade. You had to wait for the clearing. One night Sophie knocked on Elise's door well past bedtime, her face sleep-soft and anxious. "Can I sleep in here tonight?" "Of course," Elise said, lifting the blanket. Sophie curled into her side like she'd done it 100 times before. "Are you going to leave?" she whispered. "No. Everyone does." Elise brushed a hand through her hair. "Not me." The next morning, Colin looked at them across the breakfast table a moment longer than usual. His hand hovered over his coffee before he set it back down and cleared his throat. "She doesn't usually do that." "She had a nightmare," Elise said, though she knew it wasn't just that. He nodded, quiet again. By mid-July, Sophie had drawn Elise into every inch of her world. They built a fort near the lake, and a collection of painted rocks lined the windowsill in Elise's room. She taught Sophie how to braid her hair and let her pick out which socks she wore each day. In turn, Sophie told her what the birds outside her window said in the morning. Then one afternoon, as they sat on the deck with a puzzle and a breeze, Sophie looked up and asked, "If I asked you to stay forever, would you?" Elise didn't answer right away. Her heart stalled a little. She looked at Sophie's face, so serious and sincere, her hand still holding a puzzle piece halfway to the table. "I don't know what forever looks like," Elise said gently, "but I'd like to stay for as long as you want me to." Sophie considered that. "That's almost forever," she said. And from the window above, unseen, Colin turned away from the glass. The rain came in late July. Not the kind that roared or shook the windows, but the kind that lingered. A hush. A soft curtain falling between the house and the rest of the world. It turned the lake a deeper gray, swelled the moss at the base of the trees, and made Sophie's curls spring tighter around her cheeks. Inside, everything slowed. Sophie and Elise shifted their days indoors. They played card games on the living room rug, their backs against the cool stone hearth, and baked loaves of banana bread they didn't always finish. Sophie began writing stories in a small notebook, strange, whimsical things about foxes and runaway umbrellas and women who spoke to trees. One afternoon, she handed Elise a folded page with 3 uneven lines written across the top. "If I ran away, would you come find me? If I left a trail, would you follow the crumbs? If I waited by the river, would you know which one?" Elise looked up from the words, her throat tight. "Did you write this?" she asked softly. Sophie nodded, arms wrapped around her knees. "Is it about someone you miss?" Sophie's chin dipped once, barely there. Elise didn't push. She only leaned over, kissed the top of Sophie's hair, and whispered, "I'd follow the crumbs every time." That night when Colin came down for tea, a ritual Elise had come to expect around 9:30, he paused at the doorway to the kitchen. Elise was already there, barefoot, slicing strawberries for tomorrow's breakfast. He said nothing at first, only stepped in and opened the cabinet for a mug. "She's writing again," Elise said, without looking up. Colin hesitated. "She hasn't written since her mother." Elise said nothing. "She used to leave notes everywhere," he continued, pouring hot water over the loose leaves in the strainer. "Under pillows, in the garden, inside my briefcase." "What did they say?" "Nothing complicated." He took a slow sip. "Mostly just, 'Don't forget I love you.'" There was something about the way he said it that made Elise look at him for the first time, really look. Not the sleek public version she'd seen in magazines. This version looked tired in a way wealth couldn't fix. Like he'd built the house not for beauty or even comfort, but for quiet, for containment. "She still loves you," Elise said gently. He didn't look at her. "She's a child, they give it easily, until one day they stop." You think that's what happened? Colin finally met her eyes. I think people get tired of waiting for someone who never really comes back. The silence between them settled deep. After that, their conversations grew more frequent but never easy. Short exchanges in the hallway, quiet observations over lunch. Once, they stood on opposite sides of the porch during a thunderstorm and watched the sky crack wide open. She says the house is like a cave, Elise offered. She's not wrong. You don't want her to feel trapped. I want her to feel safe. Elise didn't answer, but she stayed there beside him until the rain let up, and Colin didn't go back inside until she did. One Saturday, Sophie asked if they could camp outside. In the yard, Elise asked. No, Sophie said, in the woods where it's quiet. Elise hesitated. I'll need to ask your dad. Sophie shrugged. He won't say no, he doesn't say no to you. That wasn't true exactly. Colin rarely said yes or no to anything. He measured people in silences and watched what they did more than what they said. Still, when Elise asked, he only looked up from his laptop and said, just take the radio with you, in case it storms. They packed 2 sleeping bags, marshmallows, and a tiny lantern. The tent was older but intact, and Sophie insisted on setting it up herself with Elise reading the instructions aloud. By the time dusk fell, the world outside the tent was a slow swirl of chirps and rustling leaves. They lay on their backs, the nylon above them lit faintly by the glow of Sophie's lantern. Why don't you have your own kids? Sophie asked quietly. The question came without malice, just curiosity. Elise turned to look at her, met the soft blur of her outline in the dark. I thought I would, Elise said, once. What happened? I waited too long, and then the person I was waiting with stopped being someone I could build a life with. Did he leave? No, he just didn't come with me when I moved forward. Sophie nodded slowly, as if she understood more than she should. Do you miss him? Not anymore, but I miss the idea of him, of what I thought we were. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Then she whispered, I think my dad misses my mom like that, not who she really was, but who he hoped she'd be. Elise felt something shift inside her, a truth that had nothing to do with age or experience, just raw human knowing. When they came back the next morning, still smelling like smoke and pine, Colin met them on the porch with 2 mugs of hot cocoa and a thermos of coffee for Elise. Thanks, she said, taking it carefully. You didn't have to. She said you didn't sleep much. Elise glanced at Sophie, who offered a sheepish shrug. There were a lot of sounds out there, Elise admitted. I'm more used to car horns than owls. Colin didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched just barely. You get used to them. Later that week, the first visitor arrived. A silver SUV pulled up the gravel drive around noon, and out stepped a woman in heels far too thin for the rocks beneath them. Elise watched from the kitchen window, her stomach tightening instinctively. Colin met the woman at the door. They exchanged few words, but enough for Elise to hear the name Gwen and board meeting. Sophie vanished up the stairs the moment she saw the car. The woman didn't stay long, 40 minutes, maybe less. When she left, Colin came into the kitchen and leaned against the counter near the fruit bowl. She was a colleague, he said. You don't have to explain, Elise said, though she felt her pulse still tapping at her throat. I do, his voice was quiet but certain. Sophie doesn't like her, and Gwen doesn't know how to speak softly to her. Elise nodded. It's not just about volume. No, he agreed, it never is. That night, as she tucked Sophie in, Elise found a new drawing on her nightstand. It showed a treehouse with 3 windows. Inside, stick figures labeled Sophie, Elise, and Dad. Below the treehouse was a storm cloud, and standing just outside the trunk was a woman in heels, her umbrella turned inside out. She doesn't want to come here, Sophie said, pointing at the figure. She's only pretending. Elise smoothed the edge of the paper. Your dad didn't let her stay. Sophie nodded. He never used to say no, but I think he's learning. And with that, she turned on her side and closed her eyes. Later, as Elise stood outside her own door, she felt it again, that quiet presence behind her. She turned to find Colin in the hallway, hands in his pockets. "She dreams more now," he said. "Good or bad?" "Both," his voice dropped, "but she lets you in when they come." Elise met his gaze. "Do you?" Colin didn't move, didn't blink. "I don't know yet," he said. But he stayed in the hallway until she disappeared into her room. August settled in with longer shadows and the first whisper of cool in the evenings. The lake turned glassy at dusk, and the woods thickened with the scent of pine and moss. Time became elastic, stretching when Elise lost herself in the slow rhythm of Sophie's world, snapping taut when Colin entered a room. Everything between them felt charged with things unsaid but not rushed. Nothing in this house moved quickly, and Elise was beginning to understand the weight of that. One morning, Sophie woke early and wandered into Elise's room with a question on her lips and a mess of curls on her head. "Can we build something?" Elise blinked, still half asleep. "What kind of something?" "Like a hideout, but one we don't tell anyone about, not even Dad." Elise rubbed her eyes and sat up. "You want a secret place?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "For just us." By mid-afternoon they'd found it, a small clearing not far from the North Trail, tucked behind an old cedar tree with thick roots like steps. They spent the next several days bringing in supplies: blankets, tin mugs, a chipped old lantern, and a stash of peanut butter crackers. Sophie called it the pocket. It felt like one, too, separate from the rest of the world, soft around the edges and safe. Inside the pocket, Sophie was more open than anywhere else. She told Elise about the first day her mom left and how the suitcase hadn't zipped properly. About the way her dad didn't cry, not even once, but stayed in his office until morning. How it had felt like a trick, someone switching out the whole world and forgetting to warn her. "She used to say she'd take me somewhere warm someday," Sophie said, "but she never even packed a bathing suit for me." Elise pulled her closer, heart tight. Sometimes grown-ups say things they want to believe, even if they know they won't do them. "Do you?" "Sometimes, but I try not to." Sophie looked up at her, eyes sharp in the quiet light. "That's why I like you." One late afternoon, while Sophie napped upstairs, Elise found herself outside trimming back the wisteria on the side fence. She didn't hear Colin until he was beside her, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a soft rag in one hand. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she pulled another vine down, "but it was starting to overtake the path. I like being able to see where I'm going." He studied her a moment. "I've lived here 5 years and never once trimmed that fence." "You built the house, but you don't walk through it much." His lips twitched. "You make that sound like a flaw." "It's not, but it means things grow wild when you're not watching." She wasn't sure if she meant the vines or Sophie, but he heard it either way. That night Colin made dinner, without telling anyone. Elise came down expecting leftovers and found the kitchen warm with the smell of garlic and lemon and something rich on the stove. "I had a recipe," he said, gesturing vaguely at the counter. Elise raised a brow. "From where, your soul?" He gave a quiet, almost startled laugh, and Sophie came in just in time to hear it. "Dad's cooking?" she asked, eyes wide. "Apparently." Sophie turned to Elise. "You broke him." "Maybe I just knocked something loose." They ate at the small table near the window. No devices, no rush, just the three of them and the quiet clinking of forks. Sophie declared the chicken a solid 7, which made Colin feign offense and Elise grin behind her glass. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed, Colin stayed behind while Elise cleaned the dishes. Not offering to help exactly, just lingering nearby, hands around a mug. "She's different with you," he said. "She trusts me." "She doesn't trust easily." Elise dried a plate. "Neither do you." He nodded. "It's not distrust, it's distance. It used to be necessary." "And now?" Colin looked out the window toward the trees. "Now I'm not sure what I'm protecting anymore." Elise didn't reply, but she felt it, the shift, the faint crack in the wall. They didn't touch, they didn't cross any line. But when she passed him to hang the towel, her hand brushed his, and neither of them moved away. The next day, Sophie asked if they could go into town. "We need better markers," she said, "and I want to show you the bookstore with the fat orange cat." Colin offered to drive. It surprised Elise, who'd assumed he'd stay behind, but Sophie looked so pleased that she didn't question it. They rode in silence for most of the drive. Music low, trees blurring past. Elise watched the road while Sophie chatted quietly about her drawings, her new story about a girl who lived inside a lighthouse, and the dream she'd had about the treehouse catching fire but somehow never burning down. "You dream big," Elise said gently. Sophie leaned her head against the window. "Only when I feel small." Colin glanced at Elise in the rearview mirror. Something passed between them, wordless, warm, uneasy. The bookstore was small and crowded and smelled like lavender and dust. The cat did exist and made a slow lap around Sophie's legs before curling in the sun near the window. They picked out colored pens, a stack of used paperbacks, and a tiny carved owl Elise bought without explanation. On the drive back, Sophie fell asleep. Colin pulled the car over by the lake, the water catching the early sunset. "She's never wanted to stay anywhere longer than a few weeks," he said. "I know. But she talks about this place like it's hers, not just the house. You, the woods, the quiet. She's starting to believe she belongs." He turned off the ignition, let the silence fill in. "And what about you?" he asked. "What about me? Do you belong here?" Elise didn't answer right away. Her hands rested in her lap, thumb brushing the owl in her pocket. "I think belonging isn't a place. It's the feeling you get when someone's glad you came home." Colin looked at her, really looked, like he wasn't trying to calculate anything for once, just feel it. "I'm glad you're here," he said. And there it was, simple, undeniable, the first opening of something too careful for quick declarations. Back at the house, Elise carried Sophie inside and tucked her into bed. Her small hands curled around Elise's wrist, even in sleep. Later, as Elise stood brushing her teeth, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Colin there, eyes shadowed but clear. "I didn't come to say anything," he said. "I just didn't want to leave the night without seeing you again." She stepped back just enough to let the distance shrink. "You don't have to say anything," she said. He didn't, but he stayed, leaning in the doorway, the quiet stretching out like a shared breath between them. Not a confession, not yet. Just the beginning of a truth they were almost ready to speak. The heat broke in the second week of August. One morning, Elise woke to a thin veil of fog curling through the trees and a cool breeze slipping through the window she'd left cracked open. The house, always quiet, felt quieter, not empty, just holding its breath. Sophie had slept in for once. Colin had already left early for a video call in town, claiming the satellite connection at the house was spotty, though Elise suspected he needed space more than signal. She didn't ask questions, she just let the day begin slowly. By mid-morning, Sophie padded downstairs with a blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, cheeks puffy from sleep. "Did he leave?" she asked, voice scratchy. "He'll be back after lunch," Elise said gently. "Want to eat on the dock?" Sophie nodded and they packed a basket with soft bread, fruit, and 2 mismatched mugs of cocoa. Down at the lake, the fog had mostly lifted, leaving the water glassy and still, disturbed only by the occasional ripple of a fish beneath the surface. Sophie let her feet dangle over the edge of the dock and chewed slowly, staring out into the trees. "Do you think people can change?" she asked. Elise paused. "Yes, but only if they want to." "What if they're scared too?" "Then they usually wait, until the pain of staying the same gets bigger than the fear of changing." Sophie nodded like she'd expected that, like it had been forming in her mind for days and she just needed someone to say it aloud. "I think my dad's scared he won't know what to do if he lets someone in again." Elise didn't answer right away. She watched a dragonfly skim the water, its wings catching the light. "Maybe he's just never had someone wait long enough to show him how," she said. They spent the rest of the morning reading in silence, Sophie leaning into Elise's side, the lake lapping gently against the wood. It was the kind of stillness Elise had never known she needed, the kind that didn't demand anything of her but presence. When Colin returned, his steps on the gravel were soft. He paused before coming around the trees and seeing them there, his daughter safe and relaxed, her head on Elise's shoulder, both of them barefoot and sun-warmed. He stood watching for a moment too long. "You're back," Sophie said without looking up. "I am." "You missed the last pair," Elise added, tilting the basket in his direction. "I didn't come for the fruit," he said, but there was something lighter in his voice, something unguarded. That night, Elise stayed up late cleaning the studio Sophie had half abandoned since discovering the pocket. Paints had dried in their trays, and papers lay curled at the edges where the humidity had touched them. She took her time, brushing dust from the windowsill, uncapping markers, and testing their ink on a spare sheet. She didn't hear Colin approach until he spoke. "She's drawing again," he said from the doorway. "She never really stopped. She draws differently now. She adds herself into the pictures she never used to." Elise turned to him, marker still in hand. "You notice more than you admit." He stepped inside, slow and deliberate. "I see everything, I just don't always know what to do with it." There was a chair in the corner, worn leather with a rip in the arm. He sat down in it, leaning forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "She asked me today if we could keep you," he said. Elise stilled. "And what did you say?" "I told her that wasn't my decision to make." Elise looked at him then, hard. "You're her father. But you're not something I can assign or contain. You didn't come here to be kept. You came here and found something. I don't know what, but it's changed everything." His voice didn't tremble, but it carried weight. She could feel it, the way a storm builds before it breaks. "I didn't expect to find anything," she said. "And now, I don't know, it's all so quiet here, but underneath everything is moving." They sat like that for a while. Two people in a room filled with unfinished art, trying to name something neither was ready to say. Later, as Elise stood to leave, Colin caught her wrist, not hard, just enough. "Would it matter if I asked you to stay?" he asked. Elise swallowed. "It would matter, but I wouldn't say yes just because you asked." "I wouldn't want you to." She let her hand slip from his but didn't walk away. "Not yet. If I stayed, it would be for both of you," she said. "Not because you need someone, but because you've stopped pretending you don't." Colin looked up at her like he'd heard something new in that, something he didn't realize he'd been listening for. The next morning brought the first real test. A letter arrived, tucked into a heavy envelope marked from Sophie's maternal grandmother, someone Elise had only heard mentioned once, vaguely, in passing. Inside was an invitation, a request, really, for Sophie to spend 2 weeks in New York before school began again. Colin read it in silence, his jaw set. "I don't think it's good for her," he said. "She's her family," Elise offered carefully. "She might be curious." She left when her daughter didn't even check on Sophie until now. Maybe she didn't know how. Colin looked up sharply. "Are you defending her?" "I'm just saying if people can change, maybe this is her trying too." He handed the envelope to Elise. "Would you go with her?" It was a question she didn't expect. Her fingers curled around the paper slowly. "You'd let me." "I'd ask you to, she trusts you." Sophie sat on the stairs listening. Elise didn't know how long she'd been there, but when she came down she didn't look confused or surprised, just calm. "I think I want to go," she said. "I want to ask her things about my mom, about why she didn't stay." Elise looked at Colin and something unspoken passed between them. This was what trust looked like, letting the people you love walk toward the pain, knowing they'll find their own way through it. And so 2 days later they packed a bag together. Sophie chose a stuffed fox and 3 notebooks. Elise brought her calm, her steadiness, her promise that she would never disappear. As they left, Colin leaned in, kissed Sophie's head, and then, after a pause, brushed a hand down Elise's arm. "Come back," he said quietly. "I will. And when you do." She looked at him. "We'll stop holding our breath." Then the car pulled away, and the lake and the trees and the quiet house faded behind them, but not out of reach. They were just on pause. Not an ending. A space between. New York pulsed beneath their feet, fast and humming, the sidewalks impossibly crowded after weeks in the quiet hush of the woods. Sophie kept close, her hand tucked tight into Elise's, her eyes flicking up toward the buildings as if they might tip over and swallow them whole. They stayed in a narrow apartment just off the park, lent by a cousin Elise had only met twice. It smelled faintly of old books and lemon polish, and the windows overlooked a fire escape blooming with potted plants someone else had left behind. The first visit with Sophie's grandmother was stiff. Elise waited in the foyer while Sophie stepped into the living room alone, clutching the small red notebook she'd packed. She filled it during the drive up with questions she didn't dare ask aloud. After 20 minutes, the door cracked open again. Sophie looked neither upset nor relieved, just thoughtful. "She wears perfume like my mom did," she said. "Do you want to come back tomorrow?" Sophie nodded slowly. "I think I do." And so they did, again and again. Day by day, the visits stretched longer. Some afternoons, Elise was invited in. She listened to stories told in pieces and memories softened by time and guilt. Sophie's grandmother, Miriam, wasn't warm in the traditional sense. She didn't bake cookies or remember which books Sophie had read, but she tried. She offered small truths. She showed Elise a box of letters her daughter had written, most never sent. "She wanted to leave," Miriam said once, her voice brittle, "but not forever. I think she just didn't know how to stay." Sophie sat very still beside her, absorbing the words like a stone absorbs sunlight. Not fully warmed yet, but shifting. After one of the longer visits, as they walked through the park with ice cream in hand, Sophie said, "I thought she didn't love me, but I think she did, just not in the way I wanted." Elise didn't rush to respond. "And I think that's okay," Sophie said after a while, "because I still want to come home." She didn't say where home was. She didn't have to. They returned at the end of August. The woods were different, not in appearance, but in sensation. The light had started to lean golden, and the wind carried a hush like the trees were preparing for something quieter. The lake glistened under the waning sun, and the porch still held the indent where Sophie had curled herself into that swing the very first day. Colin stood at the top of the drive when they arrived. He didn't speak right away, just opened the car door for Sophie and knelt to let her throw her arms around him. When she stepped back, his eyes met Elise. "You came back," he said. "I said I would." There was something new in his face now, not softness exactly, but presence. A willingness to be seen, to let the silence between them mean something more than distance. Sophie ran ahead to the backyard, already calling for her sketchpad, and Colin gestured for Elise to follow him inside. They stepped into the kitchen, where something simmered on the stove, herbs and tomato, earthy and rich. "I've been practicing," he said, "in case you were hungry." Elise smiled, setting her bag by the table. "Is this a peace offering?" "No," he said, coming closer. "It's an invitation." She looked at him, this man who had built walls of glass and stone, who had used structure to keep out chaos, and somehow found himself dismantled by small kindnesses, a daughter's voice, and the woman who'd sat beside it, all without forcing anything open. "You told me once you see everything," she said. "I try to." She let a breath out, slow and sure. "Then tell me what you see now." Colin stepped closer slowly, no rush, no demand. "I see two people who weren't looking for each other, who both thought they'd already lost what mattered most, and I see that maybe we were wrong." He paused, eyes searching hers. "I see the way Sophie watches for you, the way she lets go when you're near, and I see that I do the same." Elise's throat caught, but she didn't look away. "I don't need fireworks," she said. "I just need steady." "That's all I know how to give," he replied. "And I want it," she said, quiet and certain. "I want you just like this." They didn't kiss then, not yet. The moment didn't need it. Instead, Elise stepped into his arms like she'd always belonged there, and he wrapped himself around her like the idea of holding someone had just come back to him. That night they ate dinner on the porch. Sophie insisted they use the picnic blanket, even though the table was just a few steps away. They sat close, elbows brushing, laughing too loud when the dog from next door barked at a squirrel in the tree above. As the stars came out and the wind grew cool, Sophie looked up at Elise with her head tilted in that familiar, knowing way. "I'm glad you came back," she said. Elise tucked a strand of hair behind Sophie's ear. "So am I." Do you think you'll stay? Elise looked at Colin, who was already watching her. No pressure, no fear, just hope and something steadier than either of them had known in a long time. I think I already am, she said. Sophie smiled, wide and unguarded. And when Colin reached for Elise's hand, lacing their fingers together with quiet certainty, Sophie leaned her head against her shoulder and whispered, "That's forever enough for me." And it was not a perfect ending, but a beginning that mattered. Exactly the kind they all needed. Exactly the kind that lasts. Even in the quiet. Even after everything. Especially then.